My husband shamed me in front of our entire social circle, claiming our daughter isn't his based on a secret DNA test. I was devastated until I realized the truth. The test was real, but he's the one who isn't her biological father, because he's a kidnapped heir living under a stolen name. The crystal chandelier above the dance floor hummed with a low electric vibration that seemed to pulse right through my skull. It was our 15th wedding anniversary, and the ballroom was a sea of polished silver white lilies, and the faces of every person who mattered in our lives. I reached out to straighten Mark's silk tie, smiling at him with a warmth I truly felt. He patted my hand, but his skin felt like marble, cold and unyielding. When he stepped toward the microphone, I assumed he was going to talk about the Mediterranean cruise he'd surprised me with, or perhaps share a sentimental memory from our wedding day. Instead, he pulled a clinical-looking envelope from his tuxedo pocket. The rustle of that paper over the speakers sounded like a dry autumn leaf being crushed. "I'd like to thank you all for coming," Mark began, his voice steady, almost clinical. "But tonight isn't just about a milestone. It's about clarity." He didn't look at me. He looked at the mayor, then at our neighbors, the Harrisons, and finally at my best friend, Sarah, who was sitting in the front row. "For 12 years I have raised Sophie as my own. I have provided for a child I believed carried my blood. But the truth has a funny way of surfacing." He unfolded the document with a slow, deliberate flick of his wrist. "I took a private DNA test last month. The results are conclusive. Sophie is not my daughter." The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I felt the air leave my lungs as 100 pairs of eyes pivoted from Mark to me. I reached for the edge of the table, my fingers slipping against the satin cloth. I wanted to scream that he was lying, that it was a prank, but the sheer icy conviction in his eyes stopped the breath in my throat. He dropped the paper onto the floor as if it were trash and walked off the stage without a second glance. The murmurs started almost instantly, sharp, jagged whispers that felt like needles. Sarah looked away first, her face flushing crimson, and then the Harrisons stood up, followed by the rest of the table. Within 10 minutes, the ballroom was a graveyard of half-eaten cake and abandoned champagne, leaving me standing alone in the center of a ruin I didn't understand. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and heavy, suffocating silence. Mark didn't say a word as he pulled the car into our driveway. Inside, the house felt like a museum, beautiful, expensive, and completely hollow. He walked straight to the bar in the study and poured a finger of scotch. I stood in the doorway, my hands shaking so violently I had to hide them in the folds of my dress. "Mark, why?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "You know there has never been anyone else. How could you do that in front of everyone?" He turned, and the expression on his face wasn't anger. It was a terrifying, smug satisfaction, the look of a man who had finally won a game I didn't even know we were playing. "Stop the act, Elena. The science doesn't lie," he said, tapping the copy of the report he'd tossed onto the desk. "I've suspected for years. You were always too protective, too guarded. Now I have the proof. I'm done being the fool." He walked past me, his shoulder clipping mine, and headed upstairs. He didn't go to our room, he went to the guest wing and locked the door. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, before I crept into Sophie's room. She was fast asleep, her dark curls fanned out across her pillow. I smoothed her hair, tears finally spilling over. I knew with a certainty that transcended any lab report that she was our child. I remembered the night she was conceived. I remembered every day of my pregnancy. But that paper existed, and in the eyes of the law and our community I was now a pariah. I couldn't sleep. The weight of the injustice felt like a physical pressure on my chest. Around 3 a.m. I went down to the kitchen to find the report. I needed to see the numbers. I laid the pages out on the marble island, turning on the overhead light. My father had been a doctor, and I remembered enough from his old texts to understand the basics of blood types and genetic markers. I pulled Sophie's birth certificate and her pediatric records from the filing cabinet in the pantry. Sophie is O negative. I am A positive. According to the report Mark provided, he is B positive. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Something was fundamentally wrong. If these markers were correct, the science was indeed excluding the father. But it wasn't excluding me. It was showing a biological impossibility between the man who signed that report and the man I had lived with for 15 years. I realized that if the DNA on that paper was truly Mark's, then the man upstairs wasn't who he claimed to be. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air swept through me. I wasn't just dealing with a husband who was a liar. I was dealing with a husband who might be a complete stranger. The next morning, I waited until Mark left for the office, or wherever he went now that he was planning his exit from our marriage. I drove 3 hours north to the small coastal town where Mark had grown up. He'd always been vague about his childhood, claiming his parents died in a tragic accident and he'd been raised by a distant, now-deceased aunt. I found the local health clinic, a weathered brick building near the docks. I lied to the receptionist, telling her I was updating insurance records for my husband, Mark Miller. An older nurse, her hair the color of sea foam, overhead the name and paused. "Mark Miller?" she asked, pulling her glasses down. "I haven't heard that name in 40 years. She led me to a quiet corner and lowered her voice. "The Millers were lovely people, dear. But their boy, Mark, he didn't make it. There was a house fire back in the late 70s. The parents died instantly and the boy was pulled out, but he passed away in the ambulance on the way to the city hospital." My heart skipped a beat. The real Mark Miller died as a child. Who was the man sleeping in my house? Who was the man who had used that name to marry me, to build a business and to father my daughter? I spent the afternoon in the basement of the town's public library, the smell of old paper and dust filling my lungs. I scrolled through the microfiche archives of the local newspaper from 1978. I found the obituary for the Miller family. There was a grainy photo of a 7-year-old boy with a wide grin. The caption read Mark Miller, age 7. But it was the detail in the following week's community notes that stopped my heart. It mentioned a memorial service for the boy and described a unique strawberry birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on the right side of his neck. My husband had no such mark. I had seen him every day for 15 years. His neck was perfectly clear. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, the flickering screen of the microfiche reader illuminating the truth. My husband had stolen a dead boy's identity. He had built a life on a foundation of ash and lies. He hadn't performed that DNA test to catch me in a lie. He had done it because he was getting greedy, perhaps wanting to divorce me and keep the Miller fortune for himself, never realizing that by testing Sophie's DNA against his own stolen identity, he had inadvertently proven that he was the fraud. The man who had shamed me in front of the world wasn't a victim. He was a ghost who had finally left a footprint. The library's fluorescent lights hummed above me as I stared at the grainy image of the real deceased Mark Miller. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I realized I wasn't just a wife who had been publicly humiliated. I was a woman living with a total stranger. I knew I couldn't go to the local police yet. Not with the Mark I knew holding so much sway over the town's elite. I needed professional help, but it had to be discreet. I contacted a private investigator named Elias, a man known for finding people who didn't want to be found. I met him in a cramped, coffee-scented office across the county line, sliding the DNA report across his desk. I told him I was doing genealogy research on a potential inheritance, a lie that felt thin even to my own ears, but Elias didn't blink. He took the profile, the one the man in my house claimed was his, and began running it against international databases and missing persons registries. 3 days later, Elias called me. His voice sounded different, lower, more cautious. "Elena, those genetic markers don't belong to any Miller family. They hit a match in a high-profile cold case database." We met again, and this time he didn't hand me a folder. He showed me a digital map. The DNA matched the ancestral line of the Wentworths, a reclusive, incredibly wealthy dynasty based 3 states away in a sprawling estate. In the early 80s, their 3-year-old son Julian Wentworth had been snatched from his nursery in the middle of the night. The kidnappers were never caught and the boy was never found. As I looked at the digital reconstruction of what Julian might look like as an adult, the bone structure was unmistakable. My husband wasn't a social climber who found a dead boy's name. He was the biological heir to a massive fortune, yet he was living under the identity of a dead middle-class child. The question burned in my throat. Why would a man born into the Wentworth billions choose to steal the life of a Miller? The mystery pulled me toward the Wentworth estate like a magnet. I told Mark I was going to visit my sister for a few days to clear my head after the gala disaster. He barely looked up from his tablet, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he told me to stay as long as I liked. I drove for 6 hours, the landscape shifting from suburban clusters to rolling, private hills. I arrived at the Wentworth Gates, posing as a historian writing a piece on the architectural heritage of the region. I was eventually granted an audience with Eleanor Wentworth, the family matriarch. She was a woman carved out of grief and steel, sitting in a sunroom that felt more like a mausoleum. As we spoke about the history of the house, my eyes wandered to the piano where a silver-framed photograph sat. It was a black and white portrait of a toddler with a mischievous grin. I felt the breath leave my body. Those weren't just a stranger's eyes. Those were Sophie's eyes. The curve of the chin, the specific way the eyebrows arched. It was a carbon copy of my daughter. Eleanor noticed my stare. "That was my Julian," she said, her voice like dry parchment. "The police said he was gone, but a mother never stops looking." She showed me more photos, and with every page I turned, the horror deepened. The man I married, the man who called himself Mark, was the biological Julian Wentworth. But something was twisted. My husband didn't have the Mark Miller birthmark because he wasn't Mark, but he was clearly aware of the Miller fire. It hit me then. My husband's father must have been the kidnapper. He had stolen the Wentworth heir, raised him as his own, and then when the Miller boy died in that fire, he had coached his son to step into the dead boy's shoes to avoid detection. My husband was a victim who had turned into a predator, choosing to keep the stolen identity to hide the dark history of his real father. Returning home felt like walking into a lion's den. Mark's behavior had shifted from cold to predatory. He had started moving massive amounts of money out of our joint accounts into offshore holdings I couldn't track. He had also begun a subtle campaign of isolation. He told our bridge club that I was unstable and confused by the shame. When I walked into the local grocery store, the women I had known for a decade turned their carts down other aisles. One evening, as I was tucking Sophie into bed, Mark leaned against the doorframe, silhouetted by the hallway light. "I've spoken to my lawyers, Elena," he said, his voice smooth and terrifying. "Given the biological discrepancies, I'll be filing for full custody. I don't think a woman of your character should be raising a child, even if she isn't mine." He was mocking me, enjoying the psychological torture of holding a lie over my head while he sat on a throne of even bigger deceits. I had to bite my tongue until it bled, playing the role of the broken, shamed wife, all while my mind raced with the evidence Elias and I were gathering. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday when Mark was out at a celebratory dinner with his legal team, likely toasting to my upcoming ruin. I went into his private home office, a room I was rarely allowed to enter. I began searching for something physical, something the digital world couldn't hold. I noticed a slight unevenness in the mahogany floorboards beneath his heavy desk. I used a letter opener to pry up a loose plank. Tucked into the joists was a weathered tin box, the metal rusted at the hinges. Inside, wrapped in yellowed wax paper, were the original documents belonging to the real Mark Miller: the birth certificate, the social security card, and a small, gruesome trophy. A lock of dark hair that felt too coarse to be my husband's. These were the things he had kept as a safety net, or perhaps as a reminder of the boy he had replaced. It was proof of a calculated erasure of a human life. At the bottom of the tin box, beneath the stolen papers, was a small leather-bound ledger. My fingers trembled as I flipped through it. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record of payments. For 15 years, Mark, or Julian, or whoever he truly felt he was, had been sending monthly sums to a woman named Martha residing in a nursing home in a remote part of the state. The notes beside the figures were chilling: for silence regarding the night of the fire, and account maintenance for the transition. Martha had been the nurse, or perhaps the accomplice who helped the kidnapper swap the boys' identities after the fire. This wasn't just a case of a husband lying about an affair. This was a multi-generational conspiracy involving kidnapping, arson, and identity theft. As I sat on the floor of the office, the ledger in my lap, I realized that the DNA test Mark had used to destroy me was his biggest mistake. He had wanted to use it to discard me and Sophie, thinking he could start over with his stolen Miller fortune, never realizing that by putting his DNA on a lab report, he had left a breadcrumb trail straight back to the Wentworth nursery. I wasn't just fighting for my reputation anymore. I was fighting for the truth of a stolen child and the safety of my own. I tucked the ledger and the tin box into my bag, knowing that the man coming home tonight wasn't just a husband I no longer knew. He was a criminal I was about to dismantle. The weight of the tin box in my bag felt like a physical anchor, keeping me grounded as I slipped out of Mark's office and back into the shadows of our hallway. I could hear the distant rumble of his car pulling into the driveway, the gravel crunching under his tires with a sound like breaking bones. For weeks, I had moved through this house like a ghost, absorbing his insults and watching him systematically dismantle our shared life. But the time for hiding was over. I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted a total restoration of the truth. I decided to wait for the local children's hospital benefit, the crown jewel of our town's social calendar. It was exactly 1 month after the anniversary gala where he had tried to bury me. Mark, ever the narcissist, insisted we attend to show the world we were handling the transition with dignity, which was really just his way of parading my supposed disgrace one last time. The night of the benefit, the air was crisp and smelled of expensive perfume and autumn leaves. Mark was in high spirits, adjusting his cuffs in the mirror and flashing that practiced, charismatic smile that had fooled me for 15 years. He looked at me dressed in a sharp midnight blue gown and sneered. "Try to keep your head down, Elena. People are only polite to you out of pity for me." I didn't argue. I just adjusted the USB drive hidden in my clutch and thought of the Wentworths, who were already positioned in the ballroom's private balcony, shielded by heavy velvet curtains. I had spent the last week coordinating with Eleanor Wentworth and her legal counsel. The grief in that woman's eyes had turned into a cold, vengeful fire when she saw the evidence. She wanted her grandson back, even if it meant admitting the man standing in the ballroom was a biological stranger who had been raised by her son's kidnapper. When we arrived at the venue, the cold shoulder from our social circle was palpable. Conversations died as we walked past, and I saw the sideways glances and the judgmental whispers. Mark thrived on it, playing the part of the stoic, betrayed husband to perfection. During the main dinner, Mark was asked to say a few words as a primary donor. He stood at the head of the long U-shaped table, his wine glass catching the light. He began a speech about integrity and truth, clearly preparing to drop another veiled hint about my infidelity. I stood up before he could finish his opening sentence. The room froze. "Mark is right about one thing," I said, my voice projecting with a strength I hadn't felt in years. "Tonight is about integrity. But we need to look at the whole picture, not just the fragments he wants you to see." I walked over to the tech booth before the bewildered event coordinator could stop me. With a steady hand I plugged in the drive. The large projector screen lowered behind the head table. Mark's face went pale, his smug expression flickering like a dying bulb. "You all remember the DNA test Mark showed you," I told the room, my eyes scanning the faces of the people who had turned their backs on me. "He was right. Our daughter, Sophie, does not share his DNA. But that's not because I was unfaithful. It's because the man you know as Mark Miller doesn't exist." The first image hit the screen, the 1978 obituary of the real Mark Miller. I spoke clearly over the gasps, detailing the house fire and the distinct birthmark the real boy had possessed. I zoomed in on the photo of the child's neck and then pointed at the man standing 5 feet away from me. This man took a dead boy's name to hide the fact that he was the son of a kidnapper, raised to replace a stolen heir. I clicked to the next slide, showing the DNA comparison Elias had performed. The genetic markers didn't just exclude him from Sophie, they linked him directly to the Wentworth family. "He is Julian Wentworth," I announced. "The toddler snatched from his bed decades ago. He knew who he was and he chose to live a lie, sending hush money to a nurse to keep his secret buried." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp sound of a chair scraping back. Mark, or Julian, looked around the room, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He tried to laugh it off, a dry, rattling sound. "This is a fabrication. A bitter woman's fantasy," he shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged toward the projector, intending to rip the cables out, but the curtains of the balcony parted. Eleanor Wentworth stood there, her face a mask of regal fury. Beside her were 4 plainclothes officers and a federal agent I had briefed the night before. The moment Mark saw Eleanor, his bravado collapsed. It wasn't just the law he was facing. It was the literal ghost of the life he had rejected and the family his father had destroyed. As he tried to push past the table to reach the exit, the officers intercepted him. The secret DNA test he had so proudly displayed a month ago was now the cornerstone of a federal identity theft and kidnapping investigation. The very socialites who had whispered about my shame now recoiled from him, their faces twisted in horror. I watched as they handcuffed the man I had loved, the man who had tried to leave me with nothing, and let him out through the service entrance. The weeks following the arrest were a whirlwind of depositions, news cameras, and legal filings. The story of the stolen heir dominated the headlines, but the narrative had shifted entirely. I wasn't the cheating wife. I was the woman who had unmasked a decades-old criminal conspiracy. The Wentworths were incredibly graceful, inviting Sophie and me to their estate not as strangers, but as the only family they had left. Seeing Sophie sit with Eleanor, the two of them sharing the same distinctive eyes and the same quiet strength, felt like a wound finally closing. We decided to leave the town that had judged us so harshly. We sold the house, the Museum of Lies, and moved to a sun-drenched home near the coast, far away from the Miller name and the shadow of the man who had worn it like a mask. Now I sit on my new porch, the smell of salt spray in the air. I watch Sophie playing in the grass with a golden retriever, her laughter echoing against the cliffs. She knows the truth now, presented to her in a way a child can understand, that her father was a man who lost his way, but her family is much bigger and older than she ever imagined. Mark is behind bars, facing years of sentencing for the lives he helped erase and the fraud he perpetrated. He lost the wealth, the status, and the family he tried to weaponize. I look down at my hands, no longer shaking, and realize that the public shaming wasn't the end of my story. It was the catalyst for a new life, one built on a foundation of truth so solid that no one can ever shake it again. I am no longer the victim of a lie. I am the architect of my own justice.